Thanks for coming, everybody. We'll get started now. The talk today is going to be a fairly soft session. So we'll be talking about some psychology and some empathy about how we can design better APIs through the product management discipline. So hopefully a bit of an easier way to ease into the second day of the conference. Quick intro to me. I'm the CTO of a legal tech startup based in London called Basement Crowd. And we have a couple of products which are subscription-based software as a service applications. And the underlying platform is all architected on microservices. So throughout the development team, we are all building and consuming, developing APIs all the time. API is very much the glue that's holding together the platform and the businesses that we're building. An important disclaimer now is that I'm not a product manager. So I'm interested in the domain, and I've read and I've listened to product managers, and I've worked with great product managers, but I'm not one. So apologies if I get things wrong. This is my Twitter handle, GitHub. If you want to drop me any questions, I'll also put the slides out after the talk on Twitter. So let's get started. The title itself, API as a product, thinking like a product manager, it's all quite a broad term. It's all a bit fuzzy. I'm sure if we took a survey across the room as to what our expectations of a product manager was, it would be quite different. I've seen product managers have to do project management, having to do design, content, business analysis. There's a whole range of things. So just a quick show of hands in the room. Is anyone here a product manager? No? How many of us working in teams where we have a product manager in the team? Okay, that's good. And how many of you guys have a technical product manager? So that is a product manager that works with an open source library or an API or something very technical. Yeah, okay, cool, that's good. So when I'm talking about product manager, I'm talking about the person who owns the product and is kind of responsible for working out the problems the customers have and how we can solve them. And Martin Eriksson, who's the co-founder of Mind the Product, he describes it like this, with this Venn diagram. So the intersection between user experience, technology, and business, having to be conversant in all three areas, and normally a deep expertise in one. And the idea is you work in your business between these three teams, and you try to work out from a user experience how best to solve the customer's problems, whilst also understanding commercial constraints or any technical feasibility constraints as well. And I think this is an interesting diagram because my background is very much tech engineering. I still write code most days. But I find myself very much towards the middle of the Venn diagram as well. Having spent 15 years plus working in commercial organizations, I can understand how commercial teams prioritize things and why we choose to do things and ways we do. And I'm also interested in user experience. I don't know how many people would place themselves in the user experience section of the diagram, but a lot of the time when I speak to engineers, a lot of them will say, well, we're tech, or we're tech and business, but we're not user experience, because user experience is normally for the front-end developers. Normally UX, UI, that's something we don't really deal with. But I think in reality, engineers have been talking about UX for a lot longer than this term has been popular. And actually, we've just been using different language. Because from an engineering point of view, we have concepts like clean code, design patterns, we have loads of review steps over all the code, and that's all about the user experience of the code. So the reason we try to make our code clean or modular or just nice to use is because we are thinking about the next person who has to come and read this code or change the code or just understand it. And really this is one of the main takeaways from the talk today, is that actually we're all in the business of building products. No matter what role you have, you produce some output on some level, whether it be code, whether it be an API, whether it be a bug report, whether it be a change request. We're producing some kind of output that has a user experience for somebody else. So if we can learn from product management, which is a discipline all about solving problems for customers and user focus and all this kind of thing, if we can learn from that, we can all be better at our jobs, and it's a better end result for everybody. And thankfully, it's not just me talking about these ideas. If you're familiar with Thoughtworks, they produce a technology radar once a quarter. And what they do in their radar is they map out the technology landscape and they make recommendations about things you should start using, things you should stop using, things that are worth trialing. And recently they introduced this concept of API as a product, as a trial. So what that means is they're recommending organizations, both massive enterprise organizations and startups, should consider treating their API as a product and having the whole product management discipline applied to it. And in their analysis, here's what they've said. Teams that build APIs should understand the needs of their customers and make the product compelling to them. And the product orientation is the missing ingredient that makes the difference between ordinary enterprise integration and a business built on a platform of APIs. Which I think kind of makes sense, especially this last sentence. When we think about the way everything is going with IoT, everything being smart, web-enabled, the web, mobile, everything is being held together with these APIs. And so more and more businesses are having to be built on this platform of APIs. And if this is the kind of core basis of the business that you're trying to build, you want to be thinking about it sensibly and from a customer-focused point of view. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to go through a couple of different lessons that I've learned from product managers, from reading, from listening to them talk, and just working with some great ones as well. And I'm going to try and apply them to engineering and show how, if we take these lessons on board, they can help us make good engineering decisions and good design decisions. So the first lesson is don't make me think, don't make me fat, make me awesome. Okay, so the first kernel of this idea comes from Don't Make Me Think, a book of the same name. Has anyone read this book? No? So this is, it's a great book. It's really short. You can read it in less than a couple of hours. And it's kind of like a design classic. And it's written around the idea of designing a website. And it's not about the stylistic elements of design, but the functional elements of design of your website. So even if you've never been interested in building websites, there are takeaway lessons that we can learn just about design in general. So the stuff Steve covers in the book is creating visual hierarchies and using conventions. So when people use a website, they have expectations as to if they click your logo in the top left-hand corner, it will take them to the home page. They understand menus on the left-hand side. They understand breadcrumbs and nav bars. Breaking up the page into clearly defined sections. So people expect, more than anything, the content that they are looking for on your website to be in the main section of the website. And make it clear and obvious what's clickable. Make it clear what they can do with your website. And really here, what we will see as we go on is that when I say website here, these things can be applied to kind of any product in general. Physical, software, it doesn't matter. And a really great test that Steve describes in this book is, if you want to test your website once you've got it, is you take a user who's never used your website, your product, but has a relevant amount of context, drop them any page in your website, and they should be able to naturally navigate around the website and work out how to get around and work out what it's doing. Okay? Building on this idea is another design classic. I don't know if anyone's read this one. Design of Everyday Things. So this is what it says. This is more about thinking about the functional design of stuff we see around us. So doors, light switches, just regular things. And one of my favorite quotes from the book is, he says, the most important characteristics of good design are discoverability and understanding. So this ties back into that last user test of dropping a user somewhere. Can they discover the rest of the product intuitively from a given starting point? And he also has a little rant, I would say, about human error and the term human error. Because if you've ever accidentally pulled the door when you should push it, it's considered human error. People laugh, it might be a little bit embarrassing, but actually it's a design failure. So this is a door in a coffee shop across the road from my office. I don't know if you can really see what's going on here, but it's a glass door and it's got a brass handle that comes out from the door. And on the other side, it's got exactly the same handle. I go into this coffee shop every day, pretty much, and I still sometimes pull the door when I should be pushing it. And I look stupid and people will laugh at me, especially because I go there every day. But in reality, it's a design failure, because both of these handles there's a subconscious signifier here because it's a handle that you can pull. So this, even if they've got a massive sign up, which some doors do, saying push, people will still instinctively pull it because of the design. And so this door has chosen style over function, and so it's a design failure. And I think in technology, we are especially guilty of blaming people and resorting to human error. I've worked on teams that have supported software where someone's called up or emailed in and said, I've just lost all my data, your software's broken. And people will dig into it a little bit and they'll realize, oh, they forgot to press the save button or they forgot to do some action. And it'll be laughed off and we'll say, no, we don't have to do anything. It's not our fault. But obviously it is. It's a massive design failure that people can lose their data just by inaction. It should be really, really hard to lose data. It should be really, really hard for things to go wrong. And so this idea of getting out of your head the concept of human error and replacing it with design failure, because really that kind of result is on us as people who are making software, making APIs. Now, Kathy Sierra is a international speaker, author, general product management legend, and she wrote a book, A Badass, Making Users Awesome. And she's also written a lot around this idea of the implications of making customers think and why we shouldn't, and actually can we go further than just not making them think, and can we make them awesome? And she's written some stuff about some experiments that have been done around the implication of thinking. One of the experiments was with dogs. And in the experiment, they got two dogs. One of them would be put in a cage, so it's just restrained, and I had to sit down. The other dog was told to sit. And they both sat there for 10 minutes each. And then afterwards, the dogs were given a treat toy. And so if you don't know what a treat toy is, it's something like this pink thing. It's a toy that has a treat inside, and the dog has to manipulate it or roll it or chew it to release the treat, and then they get it. So it's like a mental workout for the dog to keep them occupied. And what the experiment found was that the dog who had to concentrate on sitting still for 10 minutes gave up in half the time than the dog who was just sitting still because it couldn't do anything else. And so what the study went on to claim is that we have this single pool of mental energy. Humans and animals are all the same. And that cognitive tasks, even simple things like concentrating on sitting still, use up this energy. And as we use up that energy, we have less energy for other more complex cognitive tasks, reasoning, thinking, solving problems. And this is the same principle that is behind things like decision fatigue, and why famously people like President Obama always wears the same suit or doesn't choose what he's going to have for lunch, because he tries to get rid of these smaller, kind of unimportant decisions. So he's got more mental energy for the more complex things he has to solve. And there's another experiment that Kathy went on to write about, which is with humans this time, so not dogs. They split the groups of people into two teams. One group had to memorize 2-digit numbers, and the other one had to memorize 7-digit numbers. And after the elapsed period, they wrote down the memorized numbers, and then on the way out, they all got offered a snack. So fruit, cake, whatever. And what they found was the group with the 7-digit numbers were 50% more likely to choose cake. And so what the study goes on to extrapolate from this is that this pool of energy that we are using for all these different things is also shared for willpower. So essentially the message is, if your API is hard to use and if it's making developers think, you're making your developers fat. So these are the kind of the implications of making people think, is that they're less able to do more complex tasks, which if you're asking engineers to integrate with your API, chances are they've got other complex things they need to do, and you're also making them fat. So Kathy says, or has written about this whole book about making users awesome. And if we look at, I've just grabbed these from the internet. These are just some marketing images. There's a cookbook on the left and an advert for a digital SLR on the other side. And for a long time, marketing is about trying to convince us that with their products, we will be better people. So the book is trying to convince me that if I have this cookery book and I have a dinner party, I'm going to be able to cook like this, and everyone's going to say, wow, Rob, you're amazing. And same with the camera, sorry. They're trying to convince me that if I buy this fancy digital SLR, I'm going to have photos like that. And my Instagram's going to be full of photos like that, and everyone's going to say, wow, Rob, you're awesome. And the problem is, a lot of marketing is always promising this and how great I'll be with these products, but then they fail to deliver on actually making me awesome. So if you've never used a digital SLR before, and then you go and buy this digital SLR, chances are you get out of the box, you're not going to be taking photos like that. You're probably going to be taking worse photos than you do with your smartphone because you have no idea how to use it. And they'll give you a big manual in black and white with lots of text, and it's hard to read, it's hard to understand. And chances are pretty soon, your digital SLR is back in the box and you're using your smartphone again. So what we want to be thinking about when we're building products and APIs is, can we promise and then deliver making our customers awesome? And when we're building APIs, a lot of the time our customers are developers and engineers, okay? So we'll come back to that. So how can we apply some of these basic ideas to engineering? So we've got a couple of things. Don't make me think, visual hierarchy, conventions, make it clear what actions can perform, simplicity, understanding and discoverability, and then making users awesome. So I'm going to frame some of these ideas in the Stack Overflow API. Has anyone used the Stack Overflow API? It's quite a nice example of an API, and it's quite a simple example. So if anyone doesn't know Stack Overflow is just a question and answer website. I don't know if I need to explain it, but users can post questions, other users can answer them, and that's that. So it's a fairly simple domain model to think about. And so if I was going to think about the API, if I was going to design it nicely, I would probably say, to get all questions, it'll be /questions. That's going to be my endpoint for that. If I want to get a question by ID, it's probably /questions/ID. And then I know a question can have answers. So similarly, I would say questions, ID, answers. And this is exactly what they've done. I don't know if you can read that from the back, but that's what their URL structure is for their API. And obviously, it's a pointless exercise, me pretending to guess the Stack Overflow API, having seen it before. But from this point, we can apply the test from Don't Make Me Think. We can say, if we took someone who's never used the Stack Overflow API, so anyone here, and we gave them this much information, could they intuitively work out how to use the rest of the product? Could they work out, if I said, okay, we know we can also get all the questions or all the answers for a given user, could we intuitively work out how to do it? And I'm pretty sure anyone here could probably guess what's coming. It is exactly the same pattern. So to get all the answers for a user, we know the hierarchy of the data, we know the data architecture for the site, and it is users, ID, answers. So it's the same pattern. And so it passes that Don't Make Me Think test. It uses a lot of conventions. We've got this visual hierarchy in the URL. So actually, a lot of these things that they've described about physical products or about websites actually apply to API. And if we keep these things in mind, they can help us to design nice APIs. Another thing that Stack Overflow has is this common wrapper object. So this is a pattern that I've used in lots of APIs as well. It's like a standard response envelope. So everything you get back from your API is going to be in this fixed shape. And the idea is stuff like paging, rate limiting, all that kind of metadata is always at the top level of this common response. And then the actual results are nested inside there. And again, this further helps this discoverability and understanding. If you solve paging for the list of questions, then you've solved it for all the endpoints because it's always consistent, it's always shared. So it's really not making people think, and it makes things so much easier. So I'll come back to whether or not, or how APIs can make us awesome, or make developers awesome. But first we'll have a look at some not so great examples. APIs that make me eat cake. So this one might be divisive. I'm not too sure. I know some people like to use the full range of HTTP status codes. I'm in the camp that I don't. I prefer to use a subset. And a couple of months ago when I was preparing for this talk, I was using an API and I got a 422 back. And the first thing I had to do was I had to go and Google it. And obviously I know it's a 4XX error code, so I have a fair idea. But I don't know what's the nuance. Why aren't they just giving me a 400? And I'm having to think, is there something special I need to do in this case? And there wasn't. I resolved the issue in exactly the same way as I would a 400, except there's an additional step of Googling and finding out, was I missing something? So I prefer not to. And it seems the Google search engine agrees with me, for anyone who doesn't. I Googled worst use of API HTTP status codes, and the third result was invalid data 400 versus 422. I should put the caveat in, that article actually comes down in favor of 422, so maybe I am on the wrong side. But Google thinks it's an applicable answer. So Docker. Does anyone use Docker or the Docker API? So Docker's an interesting example, and we'll go through a couple of the APIs that they have. So don't worry if you're not familiar with Docker or some of the concepts or the entities. They're just things that we're trying to interact with. We're going to try and get and create some things, okay? So first of all, we can get volumes, which is an entity. So that looks quite nice. And then to create a volume, it's not so nice. I don't particularly like verbs in my URLs, but if it's consistent and I know where I am, then that's fine. I have no real issues with this. So again, if we apply the don't make me think test, how would we get, I'm trying to remember which one I put up. How would we get the list of images from Docker? I'm going to guess get/images. But no, it's get images/JSON. And so it kind of fails that test. I'm not going to work that out. I have to go and look at the documentation. The post is the same, but that's to create an image. And then there's also /build, which builds an image, which isn't even based on the images thing. And I think this is an interesting example, because maybe some of you are thinking, this isn't a terrible API. I've seen much worse APIs, and I've seen much worse APIs. But the two interesting factors about this API is, one, a lot of the time, developers will use this without an SDK, without a client. They'll just be on a node or running locally. They'll want to debug something, so they'll just curl the URL. So they're having to remember this stuff. And what it is this slight inconsistency in the URLs. It means every time you come to curl this, you stop even only for a second, and you think, what's the URL to get the volumes? Is it /JSON or not? And it'll just be for a second, and then you'll probably just guess. And if you get it wrong, you'll try the other one. But this is every time, and it's this constant cognitive load when you try to use it, which is exhausting. And it's similar to when you go to the supermarket. Going to the supermarket is like lots of easy, very low-level decisions. But I often get to the end of a supermarket shop and I'm just knackered. I'm really exhausted. And I'll realize I've not bought some stuff and I'll say, forget about it, I'm going home. I'll get it next time. Because it's tiring, and this is a constant thing that really, wears people out. So Andrew Jordan, who's a senior product manager at Twilio, which is a very API-focused, API-centric company, he talks about this concept of flavor of your API. And all he's really saying is, be consistent. It's not really too important if you use verbs in URLs. It's not really too important if you use all your status codes or not. What's important is consistency. And he says, your API is nice to use when a developer says, I learned how to use one part of it and I intuitively knew how to use the rest of it. Which is really the same as the don't make me think test. It's about understanding and discoverability. So that seems to be the repeating message. So, how can we make developers awesome? And hopefully everyone will agree that when it comes to integrating with a new third-party API, it can be daunting and it can sometimes be painful. If your development team's integrating with a new API at the beginning of the sprint, in planning, they might be sitting down saying, there's a lot of unknowns here. We really don't know how long this is going to take us. Let's put somebody on it for the sprint, and at the end of the sprint, we should be able to make a decent estimate as to how much work is left. But then, it's awesome when it's easy and things just work. And what I mean is, I look awesome if I can build things really quickly. If 2 days later after that planning, I can go back to the team and say, hey folks, I've managed to integrate the first couple of points, I've got it running on a staging environment, look how great it is. Everyone will say, wow, that's amazing, well done Rob, you've done a great job, and I get all the credit. And then maybe the Scrum Master emails the product owners or the stakeholders and say, oh, Rob's made great progress on this API, we thought it was going to be a massive piece of work, but look how great it is. And again, I as the developer get all the credit. Nobody's saying, this API is great, even an idiot could do it in 2 days. I'm getting all the credit and I look really awesome. Because really the end game when we're building APIs is not just to have it working, it's to have loads of development teams building awesome integrations with it and then raving about it. Because we all know developers love to talk about this stuff. If you go to Hacker News, Quora, Reddit, Twitter, anywhere on the internet, you'll find people arguing to the death passionately about their favorite examples of good APIs. And these people who are out there fighting so passionately in their free time, defending an API that somebody else wrote, you know it's because at some point in their life, that API made them look good. So if we make our developers look awesome, they'll love us for it, and they'll defend and champion us for it for a long time. So the next lesson is about listening to your customers. Obviously, listening to your customers is a famous thing. Everyone says the customer's always right. Listen to your customers. Don't build things without talking to customers. But it's a bit more nuanced than that. And there's a famous Henry Ford quote that gets rolled out at every product management talk or product management intro. So I'm going to roll out as well. And he said, if I had asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. And the point here is that the customers don't really know what they want. They know they have a problem, and they can only frame their solution in the context of what they understand. At the time, people used horses to get around. Horses were expensive, horses were slow, horses took up a lot of room. So these were the problems they wanted solving. And so Henry Ford the quote is kind of saying, if you're going to ask them what they want these problems solved. They're not going to say, I want an automobile. And so Henry Ford's a bit like the original Steve Jobs product management leadership style of not listening to customers. And, in both cases, it was probably right. If Steve Jobs had gone to the market in 2006, 2007 and said, look, Apple's going to build a phone, what should we do? Customers would have probably picked their favorite bits from all the phones on the market at the time and put together some horrible amalgamation of what it should look like. Probably none of them would have suggested what turned out to be the iPhone, which has now completely defined the smartphone genre. And I don't know how many people watch The Simpsons, but there's a great old episode, which is great for product management, where Homer meets his brother Herb, his long-lost brother, who's running a large car company. And they're struggling to sell cars, so he realizes the problem is they're not listening to their customers. They're not listening to the man on the street like Homer. So he puts Homer in charge of the research and the design of a brand new car. And as you can see, Homer does what I suggested the iPhone users would have done, is that they pick all their favorite bits of their cars and put it together in a horrible mess that ends up bankrupting the company. And there's a great quote in it, which is, it's in the episode to kind of illustrate how stupid Homer is, and just because it's funny, but it's a really great product management quote. You know those balls they put on the car antennas so you can find them in the parking lot? They should be on every car. And this is exactly illustrative of what happens when you sometimes listen to customers, is that they have a problem. They sometimes can't find their car. They've seen a solution, they've seen someone else with this ball and it works for them, and they don't think about whether or not this scales, they don't think about the cost or whether it's going to be practical or whether it would even solve the problem if this was implemented. They tell you they want this. And so this is a really good example of why, you shouldn't just listen to your customers, but you should be understanding the underlying problems they have. And it paid off for Ford as well. So in 1921, 60% of the cars sold in America were Ford. But just 6 years later, 1927, that had dropped to 15%. And this wasn't because competitors getting into the market. This was because Ford was still not listening to customers and continuing just to make the Model T Ford. And what had actually happened is the problems the customers now had changed. The customers' problems were no longer about horses. They wanted faster cars, bigger cars, smaller cars, cheaper cars. They wanted variety. So their problems were now different. And General Motors listened, and they came in with their slogan, "A car for every person purpose," and created a whole range of cars for everyone. And they took a huge market share away from Ford by continuing to listen to the customer's problems. And when it comes to engineering, I think I've worked with teams that have struggled from listening to customers too closely a lot. When you're trying to build an API and you'll have a team or a customer or someone say, "We need this data, can you add it to the endpoint?" And so you add it to your endpoint. Or they say, "Oh, we're building this new page, we need all this data, can you make me an endpoint for this?" And obviously if you go down that path, you quite quickly end up with a very bloated API with blurred lines between your entities, and it's horrible to use, it's horrible to maintain, and it starts to go against all the things we've learned about simplicity and product design up until this point. But again, much like with those examples, there's sometimes examples where we want to be thinking, what problems are the customers actually trying to solve when they're asking us these questions? And are there things we should be building? So if we think about the Stack Overflow API example, if we were building that ourselves now from scratch, we'd built all our nice, neat entities, we had our questions, we had our answers. Then you probably start to think, well, actually, a very common use case for Stack Overflow is you probably want to get a question and then all the associated data underneath that. So all the answers with it, maybe the comments, as an atomic thing. And that's actually going to be an awful lot of API calls to get all that data with our nice, clearly defined entities. So maybe it makes sense to treat this as some new virtual entity, some new concept that we can serve up as an atomic, isolated thing. So, lessons from Product Managers Part 3. So this is about inertia, loss aversion, and that's the way we've always done things. So, I'll start off with a couple of anecdotes. So Netflix was founded in 1997. And at the time, in 1997, for those of you who were at home watching films, a lot of transactions when people watch films at home were done via Blockbuster. So Blockbuster was the king of watching movies and stuff at home. If you wanted a film, you'd go to your Blockbuster, you'd rent a VHS or a DVD, and you'd watch it. Netflix was trying to disrupt that by having a postal service and having more online stuff. So they didn't move to streaming until 2007, so 10 years after being created. And in the early noughties, 2001, 2002, Reed Hastings, the co-founder and CEO of Netflix, jumps on a plane to go and meet with the Blockbuster executive team to pitch a partnership with them. And he flies down there and says, "Look, you guys keep doing your in-store stuff, and we will provide the online and remote services. So we will do the postal DVDs, you do the in-store stuff. All we'll ask is you put some posters up for us in your store, and on our website we will put some things saying go into your Blockbuster store to get them in person." And the executive team basically laughed him out of the room. They said, "We've got thousands of stores all around the world. You know, bricks and mortar is our business. Why would we change this? We don't need you to do this stuff." And so Reed Hastings went away, and I guess we all kind of know how that worked out for everybody. Eventually Blockbuster filed for bankruptcy, and now Netflix is the king of home entertainment. So the lesson is really, you know, the product management lesson is that's the way we've always done things is not a good reason to do anything. Kodak. Another similar story with Kodak, but with a different cautionary tale. So in the mid-70s, Kodak was an absolutely massive company selling a huge chunk of the analog cameras being sold in America. And also 90% of analog film. So this is an analog film, if anyone doesn't know what this is. And so 90% of the market share of these things were being sold in America by Kodak. And yeah, I'm sure I don't need to explain. You need these to take photos. And so it was a massive revenue stream for Kodak, massive cash cow. And in 1976, an engineer working at Kodak, a hobbyist at home, invented a digital camera. It was about the size of a toaster, and it stored the image on electrical circuits, and then it could eventually, in about half a minute, put them on a TV screen. And he took this to the management at Kodak and said, look, I think this could really change the way we think about photos and photography. What do you think? And obviously, the management team, knowing that they had this 90% share of analog film, this massive cash cow, said, that's great, don't tell anyone about that. That's going to kill our business. So he didn't. He kept it quiet, and it was actually a lot longer later that other people started to invent digital cameras. But by then it was too late. Even in the early 90s, the Kodak management were refusing to embrace digital photography and digital cameras. And Kodak filed for bankruptcy in 2010. And obviously now, more than ever, the role that photos play in our lives is changed and is so much bigger than it was back then, and Kodak could have been right at the beginning of this curve. But they didn't, and this was to do with risk aversion, and people are naturally risk averse. People will normally try to minimize downside rather than maximize upside. So, you know, the message is all about taking these innovative chances and not being conservative and holding on to just what you have. Now, these lessons from product management is all about be innovative, take chances. You know, fortune favors the bold. Go and make these great big things, and you'll become a unicorn, billion-dollar startup. But some of these lessons are kind of contradictory to the stuff that we talked about early on. Because at the beginning of the talk, I was talking all about be consistent, use standards, make sure people understand and can easily use your product. And by throwing these things out the window, it kind of goes against that a little bit. And so we get this interesting trade-off between standards and understanding and discoverability, and not just doing things the way we always have, being innovative. And a great example of that is obviously GraphQL, right? So GraphQL has come along, and it's, getting a lot of use. People really seem to love it, but it does go against standards. It doesn't use HTTP verbs the same. It breaks a whole bunch of caching technology that's dependent on that stuff. So it's kind of making people have to rethink the standards and what's acceptable. I think a lot of people, when they first use GraphQL, they'll be like, oh, this is or when they first heard the idea, this is a bit yucky, this doesn't feel quite right, posting everything, or what about caching? And GraphQL is an interesting one because obviously it had the weight of Facebook behind it. And I often think if it came out from many other companies, it wouldn't have got traction, it would have got shot down for these reasons of not being in line with current standards or being different. The same was with React. If anyone's used React, the JavaScript framework from Facebook. At the time when React was launched, it was considered very bad form and kind of an anti-pattern to have your HTML markup in your JavaScript because it was kind of ugly and people would move towards templating and there's much better ways of doing it. And then React came along with all the markup in its JavaScript, and a lot of people's first reaction immediately was, oh no, that doesn't seem right. We shouldn't be doing that. But it was Facebook and people got excited by it, and there's enough momentum to push them past that, and kind of new standards are formed, new opinions, new design patterns are formed. So this is a very difficult one to balance up. I'm not necessarily saying don't be innovative unless you have a big tech company behind you, but it's definitely a challenge. I've worked in tech teams where we've built our own custom APIs or our own ORMs and our own DSL syntax stuff, which have been really nice and have solved problems. But I know that if we took them and tried to open source them, people wouldn't have used them. People would have said, no, this doesn't feel right. Cool. So those are my 3 lessons from product management. My conclusions, we're all building products. We all have an output. And if we can think about the customers and the end users even if that's just ourselves next week, whoever that is, if we can approach these things with this product management, customer-focused mindset, then it can help us make better design decisions and make better decisions that will result in better products right the way through the stack. Keep it simple. Try and make your customers awesome, even if the customer is yourself. Don't just do whatever's asked. Try to understand the root problem. Don't keep doing things because of tradition. But there is a very big uphill battle to overcome standards if you want to be innovative. So that's it. Thanks for listening. If anyone has any questions, then I'm happy to take them. If not, people can go and get coffee.